Hey there, FakeFox here. So after the update 35 combat preview already led to heated discussions across the entire ESO community, the update 35 or Lost Depth PTS patch notes are now out, revealing the concrete changes. In this video, I want to give my opinion and feedback on the changes from a PvE healer perspective specifically. The claimed goal of update 35 is to improve accessibility of endgame content, specifically to simplify uptime management and reduce the impact of high skill ceiling combat mechanics, like weaving. So getting straight to the point, is accessibility of endgame content improved for healers? In my opinion, absolutely not. I think the changes are completely missing the mark, further complicating PvE healing mechanics and taking control away from the player. So let me explain. The overarching theme of the changes is to increase duration but decrease power of overtime abilities, which leads to more focus on instant abilities. According to the combat preview, they hope to, quote, reduce the stress of many combat rotations, allowing you to focus more on the action in front of you rather than the action of juggling buffs and debuffs on your ability bar and making the game far more accessible. Well, this might be true for damage dealers, at least to some extent, but for healers, it achieves, in my opinion, the exact opposite. An increased focus on burst healing leads to less learnable and more reaction-based rotations. I've helped quite a few beginner healers get into endgame content over the years, and in my experience, it is far easier to teach someone a static 10-second rotation that produces enough HPS for a healing check than to teach them the exact timings for burst healing the same mechanic. It is also a fallacy to think that this reduces the need for players to keep an eye on buffs and debuff timers. Buffs and debuffs are just as important as before, but because gameplay is more reaction-based, rotations have to become more dynamic, leading to more individual timers. Longer durations do very little to change that. So personally, I actually kinda like the idea of longer and standardized durations for healing over time effects and more focus on burst healing, because I think that it can lead to more engaging gameplay for PvE healers. However, firstly, this has, in my opinion, nothing to do with increasing accessibility at all, and secondly, the actual numbers are kinda absurd. Hot durations of up to 20 seconds are just too long. Half of my rotation consisting of combat prayer spam is not engaging gameplay. A duration increase of maybe 10 to 20% would be far more reasonable, while still achieving the goal of making rotation timings more forgiving and allowing for more dynamic use of instant abilities. Further, durations are still all over the place. Combined with more dynamic rotations, this leads to even more timers, as I already explained. In my opinion, there should be a baseline effect duration, let's say for example 12 seconds, and longer effects should then be multiples of that number, so 24, 36 and so on. So durations actually line up and players can learn rotation without the need for many timers. This alignment should also take set effects and passives into consideration. These effects lining up with ability durations would significantly reduce the need for advanced tracking methods, especially add-ons. And lastly, some of the healing output reductions are just too much if incoming damage is not adjusted as well. The developer comment on that states, neither of the adjustments should make healing in PvE environments terribly difficult either, as there's an overabundance of overhealing in those encounters, and the boost to area of effect based healing over time should help improve some skill options. And that is where it completely falls apart for me. Maybe I'm misinterpreting the statement, but I feel like the development team just looked at the total healing numbers here without understanding how those form. Yes, if we look at the total healing in logs, we commonly see 70, even up to 90% overhealing. The vast majority of that overhealing though accumulates during low damage phases, because we still keep up our healing to keep our support up, even when there is no incoming damage. But during actual healing checks, overhealing drops down massively. There is still some overhealing, even in the hardest healing checks, but there also has to be, because healing is unfortunately always somewhat unreliable. And that is where we come to the worst and most uncalled for change. The tick rate of many healing over time abilities is being reduced from once per second, or in some cases twice per second, to only once every 2 seconds. So why is tick rate so important, and why is this really problematic? Well, damage over time effects in endgame PvE can hit extremely hard, and often take once per second or faster. On top of that, there are often additional incoming damage effects. When this incoming damage reaches the point where players lose close to half their health per tick, it creates a situation where healing has to match the tick rate, otherwise players just instantly die, even if the HPS is technically there. But because healing generally has a target cap of 6, sometimes even less, and targeting can be unreliable, the actual tick rate of incoming healing needs to be significantly above the tick rate of incoming damage to make up for unreliable targeting. In short, a lower healing tick rate leads to more random deaths because healing is not hitting the correct target at the correct time, leading to frustration for everyone. This issue is even amplified for weaker groups, because with lower DPS these phases last longer and incoming damage tends to ramp up more. Further, countering this issue with burst healing makes healing more difficult, again decreasing accessibility. Even for very experienced healers, reaction times of under a second can be challenging, and you also have to keep in mind latency and delays in player communication. I guess the most obvious solution would be to just not decrease the tick rate of HOTS. If that is not possible, maybe for performance reasons, adjust the tick rates and values of incoming damage to match the healing again, and also make reaction times more feasible. If healing is slowed down and damage potentially also reduced, PvE combat as a whole should be slowed down in my opinion. Also, a more reliable targeting for healing and support in general would alleviate many of those problems. Proper smart targeting for buff effects in general and separation from the healing on skills like Combat Prayer would greatly improve accessibility, as the current targeting is confusing for inexperienced players and almost impossible to manage without additional tracking add-ons. And because APM, actions per minute, is brought up again and again, I want to address this one as well. The metric APM is, in my opinion, too unspecific and not fitting for games like ESO. For a rotation, we are looking at slightly over 120 APM at maximum. Add in movement and it's maybe 160 APM. On one hand, that just isn't fast. On the other hand, it's a largely meaningless measurement. Yes, it does matter when we are talking about players with conditions that affect input frequency, but that is a completely different discussion. Still an important one though, don't get me wrong. What matters far more for this topic though is how much attention each action takes, how fast a player can make decisions and react. Even if the total APM required for a certain player performance becomes lower, which I kinda doubt, the attention needed to correctly execute each action for healers significantly increases, as I already explained in the first part of this video. And then there is the sustain issue. Especially Magicka sustain has already gotten a lot tougher for healers lately. More focus on burst healing also increases the Magicka drain further, because burst healing is significantly more expensive. While experienced healers will lose power, they are able to adjust, but less experienced healers are hit a lot harder by weaker sustain. In order to increase sustain, you usually have to sacrifice healing power, which is worse for healers that already struggle with healing checks. And with less sustain, rotation and AoE placement mistakes are also more punishing, because early recasts also affect sustain. A focus on burst healing also makes it harder to compensate for such mistakes, because it becomes a lot riskier to fit in heavy attacks or sustain abilities, once again negatively affecting accessibility. But what I actually want to end this video on is the accessibility of information. To me, knowledge is the real reason for the massive difference in player performance. We need proper in-game tutorials for advanced game mechanics, and I mean learning by doing and not just text dumps. But most importantly, we need universal and understandable rules for how combat in ESO works. So many things about targeting, stat calculation, and general PvE mechanics are not understandable to a casual player, and new exceptions are constantly added. It is currently almost impossible for a player that has not closely followed the evolvement of this game to compensate how things work and why. For example, that gear cannot be activated by other gear is overly complex and not logical for a new player, especially because it is not even consistent. Sensor Dress is activated by weapon enchantment status effects, but Elemental Catalyst is not. How is a player supposed to know that? Rules like that need to be consistent and accessible to players. Tooltips need to contain all relevant information, and character stats need to be displayed in an understandable and consistent format. To give a few examples, critical strike chance should always be displayed as a % value. The numeric values are unnecessarily confusing and hold no value for most players. The tooltips for effects like Cowardice are unclear as players don't know the weapon or spell damage of PvE enemies. Caps on stats like armor or critical damage and healing are missing from the character menu. Target caps are not included in the tooltips of most abilities. And last point, the in-game help menu contains a lot of good information but is poorly integrated. I feel like many players aren't even aware of its existence or the information it contains. The help function should, in my opinion, be integrated into tooltips and other menus, with certain terms being highlighted and linked to the related help article, similar to how digital encyclopedias work. Okay, now I'm done. Ich habe fertig. I hope my feedback somehow reaches the developers. If you want to support the cause, please give feedback on the PTS and the ESO forums. C Unicorn made a very good forum post with similar points to me. Pushing that bit can't hurt, I guess. It's all linked in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching. See you.